Demonstrations in support of Palestine are continuing across college campuses. Columbia University has had some of the highest coverage because of the number of protesters and how the administration is handling demonstrations. I'm here with Columbia University's class of 2025 President Rohan Mehta to talk about his experiences so far. Rohan, starting off, I want to get your perspective. What have you seen during these protests, and what have you seen protesters and the NYPD doing as these protests continue?
Yeah, so, what do I see during these protests? It's really quite straightforward. It's students, faculty, and affiliates, alumni, et cetera, calling for Columbia to divest from, the Israeli state and also stop investing in weapons manufacturers, et cetera, and also trying to hold the university accountable for the arrests of hundreds of students at this point at Columbia. Of course, that change in protest has come as they've started to arrest students, but that's what really I'm seeing on the ground. What the NYPD, they've been largely, I would say, pretty violent in how they've handled the protests. They're quite antagonistic. Now they're actually stationed at Columbia on campus for the next week and a half, basically, and they've been, after they were called in to arrest students on campus.
And as not only a class president, but a peer to those arrested, how have you felt watching detainments and arrests on campus? These are people that you know.
Yeah, it's horrible. I really can't stress that enough. It's so terrifying and anxiety-inducing. I've seen a few of my friends get arrested, and I think just the sight of seeing hundreds of police officers in riot gear who are yelling, who are not really respectful of anyone, show up on your campus, a place where I've spent the last 3 years of my life, and do call home. It's really scary, and it just feels weird to even be in that space again after seeing what the police have done and after seeing my friends get arrested and be treated horribly by the police.
In your Guardian article, you criticize large media companies for their mischaracterizations of the conflict on campus. How do you feel student journalists such as The Spectator and WKCR-FM at Columbia have covered the protests, and do you believe that they've been able to put their biases aside?
Yeah, I think student journalism has done a really good job here, and also independent national press, I will say. The Guardian also has a lot of good news publications that aren't op-eds. I think largely they have been able to put their biases aside. Obviously, you see editorial pieces, but the reporting that you get from WKCR and Spectator is hey, this is what we saw. We're on the ground here. We've been outside of Hamilton Hall for X many hours. Here are the things that have happened. And it really is quite factual. And WKCR especially, they were doing live reporting when the encampments were at Columbia and when the two police raids took place. And that's what everyone was tuned into, just to understand what the police were doing, where they were, what protesters were doing, where they were, and when. And I've found that reporting to really represent the narrative of what's been happening at Columbia. And it makes sense. There are, let's say 10 journalists from WKCR on the ground at Columbia at all times. Probably that's more than the one New York Times reporter walking around who's there some days not there, who obviously has limited access to students, doesn't know about a lot of the context that's been happening at Columbia for the last several months, before these protests started.
Your perspective has now been published and shared in The Guardian, which, for those listening who don't know, is one of the largest newspapers in the UK. Can you walk me through the process of sharing your story to a much larger audience?
Yeah, so writing that op-ed was a little bit of an arduous process. Took a lot of time. We started writing that last Tuesday night, so a week ago, as the NYPD began to raid our campus. Hundreds of officers showed up in riot gear. They were shoving students, reporters as well. And we were like, listen, we need to really represent what's been happening at Columbia, what's happening now, and show the world that a lot of these narratives on national media are A, not true, and B, show them what's really happening. So we stayed up that Tuesday night up until around 7:30 a.m. writing this piece. It was written by a few members of student council, and then we continued to make edits that day. And we also submitted the piece to national media in the U.S., New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic. Those are the main ones, I think Time as well. And that was kind of over the course of Wednesday and Thursday into Friday we were submitting to those outlets as we were also kind of making edits continually. And all of those publications turned it down. Some of them said, something like pretty vague, like, hey, this doesn't really fit with us. Some of them said, oh, we have a really high bar for group pieces, and we traditionally don't publish letters or op-eds authored by groups but by individuals. Some of them said, we are already pretty full this week with stuff on this, so unfortunately we can't take it. And that was the range of responses that we got, and that was really disheartening because I think the op-ed's been very well received by everyone who I know. I've gotten emails from over 50 faculty. I mean, it's gotten a lot of press, and it's a student perspective that is not anywhere in national media. And so we were very surprised, though maybe we shouldn't have been as surprised that these organizations didn't want to publish the student perspective because that's not what they've been doing. But ultimately, The Guardian said yes. Notably, of all the outlets we reached out to, it's the only independent press, or it's the only press outlet that's not owned by billionaires. And I think that says a lot about what exactly our press is saying in the U.S. And the fact that we had to go to The Guardian is upsetting in the sense that, of course, we wish a U.S.-based publication that has more of a U.S. readership would publish it, but obviously that wasn't the case.
Alumni have shared their sentiments online about how the university is handling student protesters. Class of 2013's Jeremy Bernier took to X to say he was ashamed to be an alum before citing Jewish harassment and an inability for protests to stay peaceful. Meanwhile, my own source, Ali Alman, who graduated in 2014, told me that he was proud of the student body and he felt that they were unfairly punished. What can alumni do to combat the executive overreach that you wrote about?
I think it's really pressuring alumni association leadership, pressuring board of trustees members, pressuring deans that they have access to. Obviously, different alumni will have different connections, and that means the amount of access they have to Columbia will be vastly different, right? If you're part of a student group during your time at Columbia and that student group is prominent, et cetera, you might have channels there. If you weren't, you obviously don't have those channels. But I think it's about speaking out and reaching out to anyone at this university. And if you know people in the media, talk to them and say, hey, I think this is what's not being covered, et cetera, et cetera. That's how to get involved.
I want to revisit your perspective as a student now. We've talked about campus journalists, we've talked about big media, and we've talked about alumni perspective. But now, coming back to your student perspective, as a student council representative, you serve as the president of your junior class as well. Do you feel added pressure to deliver to the student body? And if so, how do you react to it?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely added pressure, right? I mean, campus is in turmoil, and every aspect of student life has been affected, right? Like most clubs have had to cancel their shows or end of year kind of projects, parties, et cetera. Even getting dining hall access, right? If you don't live on campus anymore, like within the 6 or 7 dorms that are physically within campus and none of the dorms that are, in the blocks around Columbia, you can't access campus, which means that your ability to go to a dining hall is severely limited. There's only one dining hall you can access instead of like the 8 that there normally are. So we've had to step up, and the pressure is obviously can be at moments like over the course of last week. It's like emotionally and mentally I've been suffering, and I still need to step up for my peers, right? We had to write this op-ed. We have been feeding students. The responsibility of feeding students has largely fallen on us. We've been hosting dinners where we cater from local restaurants and host dinners in the patio of one of these dorms that are off campus. So students who are off campus have access to food besides that one dining hall, which closes relatively early, et cetera, et cetera. So we've really had to start doing more, and I'm happy that I'm able to have this impact. It does give me at least an avenue of hope and an empowerment to say everything here has become horrible, right? We're seeing hundreds of cops on our campus every day. My peers have gone to jail, but at least we're trying to do something.
With responsibility falling on you and your fellow peers on the student council, like you say, how much power do you have as class president in a matter like this?
Yeah, so obviously our power is pretty limited, right? I mean, I'm not on the board of trustees. I'm not in daily dialogue with university president, et cetera. But we have lots of ability to help our students and physically comfort them, whether that means giving them food, et cetera. And B, we do have access to lots of administrators like the dean of Columbia College, who, some of my peers are in constant communication with. The university president has met with a few of us, not with myself, but with the student body president at Columbia and some other elected student representatives. That happened only on Friday after, everything had happened, and it seemed like she realized what the mistake was and was trying to hopefully, apologize, et cetera, though she hasn't really done that. But power is obviously limited. That doesn't mean we're powerless or we can do nothing. We always have things that we can do to help out students.
And my last question for you today is, what more actions do you feel that you are going to take to implement solutions that need to be applied to curb the rising rates of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia when seen on your campus?
Yeah, I think obviously all of those hateful acts are horrible. None of them should ever happen again, or should ever happen in the first place. I think what needs to happen is first is a de-escalation of tensions on campus, and that comes, I think, from the university administration making steps to start healing within our community and to start promoting dialogue between students. I think on campus, I will say, most things have been vastly peaceful. Protests on both sides have been mostly vastly peaceful. There's been some anti-Semitic acts, horrible. There have been some Islamophobic acts. Those are obviously horrible too. I think the media has sensationalized the amount of those that there are. And I think the way to move forward is by de-escalating tensions on campus and reigniting the Columbia community, which is one that is based in love and empathy.
Once again, Michael Dent here with Rohan Mehta. Rohan, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you so much for your story.
Yeah, of course. Anytime.
Have a good one.